This episode contains specific and graphic information about a crime. Please be advised.
The bad guy caught her by surprise. The last words that my sweet mom heard before being tased was that she was about to have a very bad day. And so it was just as if my mom had just disappeared. They both made this horrible decision. Instead of letting my sweet mom go, they took her to a very remote area and ended her life and buried her in a shallow grave.
Welcome to True Crime Prevention, the podcast that melds true crime with real solutions. Let's expose how all crime starts the same way, with a chance. Today, we won't give it a chance. I'm Paul DelPonte, and I work with McGruff the Crime Dog. Thanks for joining us. Today, we're going to be talking about the dangers and hazards associated with a profession a lot of us are very familiar with, but we also don't realize it involves a lot of independent work, not inside an office or store, and that's real estate. We're going to be talking with Carl Carter, who is the son of Beverly Carter, who's a real estate agent and encountered a tragedy as she was doing her job down in Arkansas. So we are going to be talking about a crime. So I do want to warn our listeners and viewers, we're going to get into some details that some people may feel uncomfortable with, just so that you are aware. And for those who are new to the podcast, please click like and subscribe. And we're going to pause for a minute to hear a little word from our sponsor. And we'll be right back with Carl.
This episode is brought to you by me, McGruff the Crime Dog, America's favorite crime-preventing canine. Check out the brand new True Crime Prevention mug by visiting the McGruff shop. It's perfect for sipping morning coffee while listening to a new episode or preventing crime in your community. 100% of the profits support crime prevention programs. Shop the mug and much more, like t-shirts, hats, or toy cars at mcgruff.org. Use code TRUECRIMEPREVENTION for 25% off. Let's take a bite out of crime together.
We're very pleased to have with us Carl Carter from Little Rock, Arkansas. Carl, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Paul. It's an honor.
Great to have you on. And it's a very interesting story that involves Carl's mom, Beverly, who unfortunately became a victim of a crime. And we're going to get into that and into the details and into sort of the hazards of the job of being a real estate agent and some of the other professions where you're not around people you know and trust all day. But Carl, thanks again for joining us. Let's start. Just tell us a bit about your mom, just as a person, as a real estate agent, and as a mom.
Well, and not just saying this because we no longer have her, but she was the very best mom, and she was my very best friend. She was the mom of three boys. I'm the oldest. My mom had me at a very young age. She had me when she was 16. So in a lot of ways, we grew up together. One of our favorite things to do, we ran 5Ks and 10Ks together. We had some college classes together, which was an interesting dynamic. But she was a little spitfire. She was very sweet and very, very Southern. As you said, we're from Arkansas, and she's she's a lover of people, lover of her job. And I would be doing her a big disservice if I didn't tell you about her very favorite role in life, which was not about being a wife or a mom or a real estate agent, but rather it was being a grandma. So her very favorite role by far was spoiling the grandkids.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. How many grandkids?
So she has, well, at this point, she has a total of, 8. So
8. Wow.
Quite a crew.
Yeah. That's wonderful. As we mentioned, she was a real estate agent, and one day she was just doing her job. Tell us sort of how that happened. And, I guess, the thing that runs through my mind is, you wake up one day doing something that is all very ordinary. And then all of a sudden it turns into your worst nightmare, basically. So, yeah, what happened?
That, and that's exactly right. When I talk about the day that my mom first heard from the bad people, as I call them, it really was, just a regular, ordinary day. And my mom began to hear from a couple husband and wife, and they were contacting my mom with a request to help them purchase a home here in the central Arkansas area. And they gave her, their background, gave names, their story. The background that they gave was that they had relocated here from out of state. They had come for work,
Mhm.
currently living in a rental situation, and wanted, a permanent residence as soon as possible. Mom spoke to both, husband and wife, and of course, over this process of trying to get to know them and what they were looking for in a home, very customary for
Sure.
real estate agents. Uh, she, really, really had a lot of conversation with them, and this process from when she first heard from them up until the first home that she would show them was really about a 2-week period. And so there was a lot of this back and forth phone, emails, texting that occurred. And, ultimately, when this appointment was set for my mom to show them this house, um, it was a house not that my mother had chosen, thinking that they would like to see it, but it was one that they had found on their own and requested to see it. And, in hindsight, it's evident that, what was coming across probably to my mom as very selective home buyers. They didn't want to tour any of the homes that she was
Right.
in their way.
And I'm sure in all this back and forth for that week or so,
Yeah.
you have that dialogue that goes on, and with the dialogue, there's a certain level of trust that you start to develop.
Absolutely, absolutely. My sweet mom, not realizing all the while that, what was coming across as a selective, buyer couple was actually, these criminals that were looking for the perfect property that was vacant, just far enough away from neighbors so that there wouldn't be witnesses. They were looking for a crime scene, the perfect house that they could get her to show to them so that they could kidnap her.
Oh.
And they had devised this plan to hold her for ransom. Um, and they did not know my mom. They'd never met my mom face to face, but they perceived her to be extremely wealthy. And you probably agree with this, Paul. And there just seems to be a public perception that real estate agents, are wildly successful, and they've got the nice cars.
Right.
And so, it's really believed that, her profession and, marketing and photos and evidence was found on their laptop that they had done some Google searches. They went to her social media.
So they were purposely looking for a real estate agent, and then they were sort of banking on, they probably looked at different listings and probably saw your mom on several and jumped to the conclusion that she was wealthy. Is that basically?
Yes. And, devised this plan. And so when they contacted her and they assured her that both husband and wife would be at this showing, which was set at 6 p.m. in the evening. And it was a fall day. Days are getting shorter, and there's no utilities at this particular home. And so, we know that my mom gave them a number of safety reminders about the importance of, them getting to the house you know, before it got dark, no utilities and such. And so, um, but when my mom arrived that day to that home, there in that moment,
They're in that
the
moment.
husband,
And
yeah,
you had
arrived.
mentioned that they picked a house, and how remote was it? It was
Yeah, so it outside city limits. There were neighbors. The homes on this particular street were situated on their lakefront, and they were on half-acre lots. So there were neighbors, but it
okay.
certainly was somewhat secluded. When mom arrived, and then the bad guy, the husband of this couple, arrived with an apology that his wife had gotten caught up at work and would be unable to make it to the showing, and had a request. Will you please continue show me this home, take pictures of the interior, text them to my wife, be available throughout the showing to answer any questions my wife may have. And it'll be kind of like she's here with us, at least in some virtual sense.
Okay.
And sure enough, my mom begins to get text messages from the wife saying, "So sorry about this. Will you proceed?"
Mm-hmm.
And so suddenly, my mom's put in, if I can imagine that was a somewhat uncomfortable moment where, you have a plan and then suddenly, right as you're at
Right.
it, that it changes. And, even as I tell you this now, like that burning that in my stomach, that instinct.
Right. I can imagine probably your mom thinking, okay, you're a salesperson, you're eager to make a sale. And you're thinking, okay, well, all right. It's in this day and age, taking photos on your cell phone and sharing them over text or is not totally unusual. So, it may have maybe have given her pause, but probably not enough to like send an alarm bell.
Sure. And agreed. And it's not all that uncommon, right? Homes for sale have great presence online now, but this particular home didn't. It really just had one very poor quality external shot. So, in a way, the fact that it was so poorly represented online really gave them kind of extra credibility in asking my mom to take these photos for them.
Mm,
But being she was so sweet, and um, she agreed to do just that. And it was very haunting to later after the trial to get my mom's phone back and see that the last 10 photos on her camera roll were of her really just as she's going through this house taking these photos and unknowingly documenting her very last moments of freedom.
mm,
And it's believed that as she was taking that last photo, uh, the bad guy got himself positioned behind her, caught her by surprise with a taser in her side, and he's been very proud to admit that the last words that my sweet mom heard before being tased was that she was about to have a very bad day.
mm. Wow. That's,
He
yeah. Give you a minute to collect yourself. And so how did, I'm going to jump ahead a minute and then we'll get back, but how did you first hear what happened?
I began to hear from my dad later that evening, and he texted and then he immediately called and he said, I'm not, your mom's not replying to my phone calls and my text, and I'm worried. And, my mom had been in the business for about a dozen years. And so, I'm, a little ashamed to admit this, but, I'm like, Dad, come on, this is how real estate goes. She's writing a contract. They brought in additional family for a second showing.
Right.
Let the lady do her job. And,
Right.
my dad
Oh,
just, he did-
in all plausible things.
oh, yeah, sure, sure.
Yeah.
But it was just very uncharacteristic of my dad. Like he, to just be worried and to hear that worry in his voice. And so I actually lived close to my mom's office, her real estate office. Coincidentally, my parents lived somewhat close to this house that she was showing. My mom had told my dad she would be showing that particular property. And so I encouraged my dad to drive over and assess, what was going on. I was like, Dad, it's going to be awkward, if you're just, walk in on their showing, but, just if it's going to make you feel better, you go. And I'll go over to Mom's office. I'll see if she's there. And, my poor dad, when he arrived on that scene that night, he arrived to this vacant home, the door wide open, no utilities, everything's pitch black. But there in the driveway is my mom's car, and it's locked. And my mom's purse, he could see, was in the back, uh, and so it was just as if my mom had just disappeared.
Wow. Then, you'd mentioned kidnaps. So what was sort of the next step? And at this point, I'm guessing your dad reached out to you. And there's panic, I'm sure. Did you call the police? What was what was the next step?
Yeah. So in that moment when he arrived and saw, the house and the state that it was, and mom's car, immediately encouraged him to contact the police. And, they arrived very quickly. There are so many things at play, right? Because we could still brainstorm real estate scenarios that she could still be safe. And this could just make sense. She could have gotten in the car with this couple to go see another house. That's not a best practice, not the safest thing to do. But if they were all friendly, there were just kind of plausible
Sure.
explanations. And, um, but, that law enforcement arrived on the scene, very, very quickly. And of course, the later it got, the harder it was to justify that, that this is just, business as usual. And what we didn't know is that awful man had backed his car up to this home and opened the trunk and put my sweet mom in the trunk and drove away. And that night, as we were sitting at that property and trying to call mom, text mom, brainstorm, call other agents to learn as much as we could, um, my mom was locked in the bathroom of the
Mm.
home of this couple, and their plan was to use their cell phones to take videos of my mom so that she would, in her words, tell my dad how to deliver this ransom money to them.
So it very much was, as we imagine, a kidnapping.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Absolutely.
um, so she started. They had her recording videos, and they were sent to your dad or to the real estate office, or
So the videos, so we know that they took one that was later played during the trial because it was played during interrogation process. It was never delivered to my dad. Um, their plan fell apart too quickly.
okay.
And how they had planned to get that ransom money was to have my dad push this imaginary wealth into accounts that were accessible with credit card or cards in my mom's purse. But in this bad guy's haste to kidnap her and all that awfulness that he did, my mom's purse had been locked in her vehicle and it was out of sight, out of mind. And that day when he drove off with her, he was leaving behind the very mechanism that he was going to use to get this money. So he, upon realizing that, as my mom was locked in their bathroom and the wife stood guard at the door with a firearm to keep my mom from escaping, the bad guy drove back out to the scene of the crime. And he was stopped right there by us. And he was questioned by a law enforcement officer about the disappearance of my mom. He denied knowing anything and fled the scene. And it sent he and his wife into a complete panic. The realization that their plan was not going to work. He had served prison time before, didn't want to go back to prison. And they both made this horrible decision instead of letting my sweet mom go uh, to end her life. And they took her to a very remote area and took everything that she had on her person of value, jewelry and phone, and um, ended her life and buried her in a shallow grave.
I'm so sorry that you have to deal with that for the rest of your life. Your dad dealing with it, the grandchildren who she loves so much. And that is the hard part about a gruesome crime like this is it doesn't end when the crime ends. It keeps going in many different ways, affecting you, the community, others. I'm assuming then if they were able to bury her, that some time is continuing to pass. How much time are we looking at before you sort of know anything more?
So my sweet mom, that appointment was on a Thursday afternoon at 6 p.m. And it's believed that uh, Her murder occurred in the very early morning hours of that next day, the Friday. And through the work of 26 incredible investigators that didn't sleep, didn't go home to their families, uh, my mom's body was found on the following Tuesday. So there was a
Wow.
number of days there where we just had no idea.
Right.
And the investigators were doing their part on, but then there were also huge search groups that were organized to
And
try to
then you say found her. How did they find her? She was buried.
truly incredible. So these bad people, part of what they did to deceive my mom is that they had used fictitious names. They created email accounts with those fictitious names. They downloaded an app on their cell phones that gave a spoof number to hide their true number. So all the while they had this anonymity, and we can get away with it. And it 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 started the with the investigators being able to work with the phone carrier to find out the real number behind those spoof numbers. And so that led to this couple. And ultimately this place where my mom had been buried is on the back side of what I call a concrete plant where they store the trucks after they do these big jobs. And the the husband of this couple had at one time worked there, and his cell phone had been pinging in that area, and the fact that they were able to connect all those dots just blows my mind. They really began to think that she was likely on that property, and
Hmm.
took out, I mean, they were middle of the night, I mean, they took out big searchlights and ultimately found her.
Wow. So it did sound like there was, the police involved, to their credit, went above and beyond.
Amazing.
It's great. And I'm sure that
Absolutely.
gave some comfort in a situation where it's very difficult to find comfort. But so I assume the couple were arrested shortly after or in that day. Is that
It really turned into a bit of a fiasco. Another day passed. We're in that Saturday air window of mom missing, and the husband was ultimately apprehended after running from law enforcement. It was unknown for actually multiple weeks, the wife's role, and so she was not taken into custody until almost a month later.
wow, wow. And and in this process, you and your dad are grieving and trying to figure out life in general for yourselves, as well as I'm sure being consumed by what happened and how, and bringing this person to justice. Um, what was that month like?
It was, surreal in so many ways, right? Because one, like this is like she was the matriarch of our family. She was the good, and not that anyone deserves anything like this to happen to them. No one does. But like she like would be the last person that she was lovely. And so just dealing with like, how could this happen to such a sweet, sweet lady?
Sure.
And then, weighing that. So you've got personal grief. And then it hit I mean, as soon as she went missing, it hit the national news cycle. And so it was playing, and I saw that as an opportunity that I could hopefully leverage to try to find her. And so, I was throughout the day doing, national, interviews like, please help me find my mom. And then, alternatively, while she was missing, there were other ways that people tried to victimize our family. We were being contacted by, and it was almost like out of a movie where, your phone rings and it's this really raspy, scary sounding voice. And they say, I have your mom. And if, give me money, $1 million, and I'll, give her back. And those crimes had nothing to do with my mom. It was other other entities trying to be, seeing this opportunity. And then, with that national spotlight, I mean, we went from just normal family, just,
Sure.
you know, to some of the media were so aggressive that they were standing outside my dad's home and putting their cameras up to the windows. And so suddenly, I mean, it is just a glass house that we were all living in. And we saw and we recognized quickly that we were a representation of my mom. And so we had to really do our very best to try to play this. I hate to call it a game, but, play this process to find her. And, for the weeks that after, so both of the bad guys end up, in jail, but then the husband loves all of this attention. And so he begins doing interviews that were so inappropriate to have ever happened with media. And he's writing letters and he's getting them from the jail out. And it was just an absolute circus for what.
So he's in jail, in custody, and still doing interviews.
Yes. And that ended up being a big misstep. And, I think people at the jail lost their jobs. And,
Wow.
but I mean, it was just like that particular instance, they got 3 hours of interview with him, a local news station. He was really he was in some ways proclaiming his innocence and coming up with these very far-fetched, awful, awful stories to explain my mom's death. And that really kind of disparaged my mom and tarnished her name and just continuing to victimize her. And, it was in those moments, as terrified as I was, I had flipped from please help me find my mom to I'm going to stand up and I'm going to be the voice that she no longer has. You can't take her life and then tarnish her name. Like you can't.
Right.
So yeah, it is, it's to the point you made, so many people don't realize that, once they go to jail and then later to prison, it doesn't stop for the families.
No, it doesn't. It's not a quick process.
No.
The wheels of justice turn slowly. You are innocent until proven guilty in the United States and all that. And if lawyers like to do one thing and they do it well, it's to stall and buy time. And so this is what time period are we at now? How much time has passed? You're at about a month mark, or is it?
So, from the biggest, circus, of it all, happened, from that month, 2 months, 3 months. And, we would go to every hearing, that, that he was to be present and just hear, how at times he was representing himself and then he gets he gets an attorney appointed and then they fired him. And so there's this ebb and flow of the dramatics of it all. And so, ultimately, the trial itself didn't happen until, just over, a full year after the crime. And finally, made it to that point. And the wife took a plea deal. And so in exchange for her truthful testimony against, her husband, and she got a 30-year sentence for first-degree murder, and she will be eligible for parole when she served 21 years. And so I will, of course, if I'm still around when that mark hits, I will be rallying
Opposing it.
Yes.
Sure.
The husband is in prison forever. He received a sentence of life with no parole for capital murder and kidnapping.
And that was via trial, or yeah?
It was via trial, and
How was that process? Again, they have to put on a defense, and many times the defense tries to victimize the victim. How did that go?
It was hard at first. It was a 3-day trial, and we it was particularly hard because, if you just imagine this courtroom and you've got, it's an aisle down the middle for everyone that's there to observe. And but the on the right-hand side of the room, really the proceedings were blocked because there was a large screen that had been placed right over by the jury,
Mhm.
and they would it was positioned so that the family, anyone in, would not see the photos of my mom when her body was recovered. So understandably why that was like that, but it blocked half of the courtroom. And so the family wanted to be able to see, right? What not
Sure.
certainly not the pictures, but wanted to be, in see what was happening in the courtroom. And so, all that to say, we were front row and we had to sit right behind. I mean, almost just to reach out your arm and touch the man that had killed my mom, and
Wow.
that for 3 days. And there were even moments, just to give you like how hard it was. Like, they had brought in for him candy, and so this small, colorful candy on it. And while they were showing the jury these pictures, horrific pictures of my mom, and this awful man is, contorting himself so that he can see the screen of my mom and being unearthed. And he's just popping candy while he's bending and
Mm,
contorting to try to see the screen. And it's just so disturbing. And
sure.
the whole time too, you're looking at the jury, and you realize they all need to, agree that, that this person is guilty. And so you're just terrified that, are they paying attention? Did they catch that? Uh, the trial, for the first time, I understood why you see families have just this emotional release when the verdict is read.
Sure.
I never got that before. It's like, why do they fall apart? Why do they, and when it's your family member, you're like, thank goodness, like, justice has prevailed.
Mm,
And it was quite overwhelming. But I'll say, the last day, back to the video of my mom, this ransom, where my mom, in her own words, telling my dad that she'd been taken and not to call the cops. And that was never sent to my dad, but was played in the trial. And the prosecution asked me to take the stand to identify that that was my mother's voice, and I did. But then the defense, when the bad guy himself requested to be able to go up and speak, and when he was questioned about, how do you explain this? How do you explain this audio that was played of Miss Carter? And he said that that was his voice, and that he had used technology to adapt his voice, and it did such a good job that, it even tricked her own son into believing that it was her. And it was so absurd
right.
that in that moment, you still don't know how the jury's going to go, and there's no guarantees, but in that moment, you could just feel this turn of everyone in the room just going, "You have got to be kidding me." And so, kind of the tension for me,
Mhm.
well, anyway, began to kind of lower as we were going, and, it got so absurd.
Right. Now, you had mentioned earlier that he had a prior record. Do you know what was he still serving time? Was he out on parole? Was it,
So
uh
he was out on parole. He was one of these career criminals that had been trying to tell the system, trying to tell us all that, he's a bad guy. All of the crimes, or the ones that I know about, involved him stealing things. And so he had been, a server at, a restaurant, and he was, going, people give their credit cards to pay for their meal, and he's, stealing their numbers in the back with this, skimmer. And so he's this identity theft process. He had stolen
Hmm.
vehicles. And so with every offense, he kind of upped the ante. And so, he had 7-time felon in all of these
Wow.
schemes to try to take from other people. And, ultimately came up with this idea that, this lady, and they perceived my mom, their words, they thought my mom was so rich that they would get enough money to never have to work again.
Wow.
And that could not be further from the truth. Just
Right.
very middle class family.
Okay. So, um, we're very glad that at least justice was served, and you got the conviction. And then you realized you need to do more. And this is I guess the brighter side of the story. Tell us a little bit about when you started to realize, hey, come to think of it, being a real estate agent and showing houses on your own, it's kind of got some things we got to think about and talk about there. How did that start all coming in your mind and connecting?
Well, I think it's in large part the fact that my mom's story went national and international, that real estate agents from all over the world began to outreach to me, and they would, so kind, and all the things that they would say, but it it began to pile up that they would say, "So sorry for the loss of your mom. I'd like to tell you my story."
Mm,
And so I, would hear from in various ways, whether it's an email or a call or, running into people on the street, even buying groceries. And they would tell these stories about, whether it's, stalking, harassment, the theft of property. There's, this huge, risk of, open houses. And if you're still living in the home and people coming in and stealing your prescriptions, there, it was as if every agent either had a story or could certainly relate to the uneasiness of working alone with
right.
sometimes strangers.
Sure.
And it just became heavier and heavier to me. And I
And
am a
then you
firm
did.
believer that stories impact people, stories
Absolutely.
change. And so, it put a fire in my belly, and so founded a nonprofit that is, it's my sweet mom's name, and Beverly Carter Foundation, and its mission aligns very well with the great work that you all do, and it's really about prevention and what we can do to proactively keep these precious, hardworking people from hopefully, ever finding themselves in a situation like my sweet mom did.
Good for you. And that really is, I think, I hope that that work is both therapeutic and good for you. And it also extends the love of your mom and brings it out to others. And I'm sure she uh, w- uh, would be proud of you for doing that, certainly. So tell us a little bit more about the foundation. How can people get in touch with the foundation and those kinds of things?
Sure. So we, have a website, beverlycarterfoundation.org, and we have, a number of training materials that can be they're easy. You can pull them down, especially if you are in the real estate space. They're, very, we could do, there are general safety measures, but then there are also some very hyper specific to different parts of the work that real estate agents do. And you're welcome to any of those materials. Of course, we're on social media, and then we offer in person and virtual classes. The National Association of Realtors has actually designated September, the month of September, is Realtor Safety Month. And so, all throughout September, but of course for us in this space, Everyday Safety Day. But so we do a lot within September,
Sure.
to help raise awareness within the industry.
Wow. And reaction from the industry. I mean, there's some big companies involved in real estate. In terms of awareness raising, I'm guessing through this work, you probably have told some of these companies some things they didn't know before or think of. How's that sort of eye-opening experience been for you and others?
I must admit, I think when I first, started down this path, I think there was some fear from especially some of the larger companies that, this was going to, spread this fear of working in this industry and run people away and kind of vilify the big companies. And when I think through time and they see that the work that we do, that putting blame where blame is is due, not on some of these companies, that we can
Sure.
trust and we bring partners. And we've seen so many of these big companies like where they shied away from the safety conversation, or they shied away for, you have these member benefits being associated with these groups where they're offering
Hmm.
safety related technology, and sort of seeing really this shift and those
Good.
big companies are really, I think, to be
Good.
thanked for that.
And I will say that is why one of the things we preach is the power of awareness, because it shines a light on the problem and who the real victims are, and who the real culprits and the criminals are. And there's one basic thing that McGruff has said from day one of being McGruff. Uh, Crooks don't like lights. They make them nervous. And when you shine a light on a problem, a lot of people, we deal with all kinds of crimes, crimes. Crime happens everywhere, sadly. And it's not the place where it happens that is to blame. It is the criminal to blame. And we need to shine the focus on that. And that's exactly what you're doing. So congratulations for doing that. And
Thank you.
it's a very important work, and glad to have you on to be able to partner with you to spread that word. And it's the Beverly Carter Foundation. And we thank you for joining us here on True Crime Prevention. And where we did get to sort of the truth of sadly what happened to your mom, but the living legacy that you're giving her and her life that will help keep others safe. I commend you for being able to share the story. It's not easy, and I'm sure your motivation for sharing it and going through almost a reliving of the worst days of your life is out of motivation to help others, and for that is highly commendable.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Go on over to the McGruff store and pick out something that will show your visibility to the community that you're against crime and you're for crime prevention. So on behalf of the National Crime Prevention, McGruff the Crime Dog, and True Crime Prevention, Carl, thank you for joining us, and thank you out there for listening.
That's an easy way to take a bite out of crime.